All right, so picking back up where we left off on the second day of our section on self-identity and social identity. But before we get started, a few quick updates and reminders. Quiz 2 is graded. Activity 2 is also graded with comments. So go and check that out. If you want some more feedback on that, I recommend listening to the longer review I did on it that was posted with the lecture on one of the lectures on symbolic interaction. And activity 3 is due this Friday at 11:59 p.m. And make sure that you're watching the supplementary videos posted for this week as well. And because it's a bit long, I recommend going ahead and getting started on the assigned reading for next week so that you're not stressed out trying to read it at the last minute before taking the quiz. Which brings me to something I wanted to address with you all regarding activity 3 and all subsequent activities and quizzes. So I understand the desire to work ahead and get stuff out of the way because you all, I'm sure, have, very different schedules and you have a lot of other things going on, and I get that. But the reason we're not having class in person on Friday is because, well, one, typically we would have in-class discussion. And so since we're not able to have in-class discussion, we're doing activities. And the activities are designed to help you. They're more laid back. They're not as formal as like maybe the quizzes. But it's to give you an opportunity to apply some of that knowledge that you gained during lecture. And during that first week, especially of a section, that's when we're doing a broad overview of the key terms and concepts for each section. And so those activities are to demonstrate that you're engaging with the material, but it also gives you an opportunity to engage with and apply those key concepts and key terms. And most of the time, the activities will be asking you to reflect on your own experiences or to, like the last activity, to consider, different film clips and what you're seeing, but it's much more laid back, and it's to give you that space to actively engage with something and apply these skills and these concepts from each section. But what I'm noticing, especially with activity 3, is that I would say a little more than half, or about half of you, have already submitted your activity 3. And again, I understand the desire to work ahead, but I find it concerning when you've submitted the activity before consuming any of the material, before even knowing what that section is going to be about. And that even if, let's say you felt like you got a lot from the first lecture, enough to complete the activity, that was still one theory within this section on the self-identity and social identity. We covered identity theory. And today we're covering social identity theory. And so what I'm looking for in these activities, like I said for activity 2, is I'm looking for you to apply these concepts in terms. I'm looking for you to answer each question from that perspective. So in this case, I'm looking for you to answer these questions from an identity and a social identity perspective. And if you're completing the activity before you've even been exposed to the material, you're not going to be able to do that. At least you're not going to be able to do that very well. And so you're probably not going to do as well in the activity. And again, the whole purpose of that is so that you can engage with it. And then I'm making sure that you are engaging with the material and you are, applying it to different situations in your own life. So please make sure that you are utilizing the time that we are not spending in class on Friday, since that time should already be blocked out of your schedule to complete the activity. And the activities and the quizzes are not designed to take an obscene amount of time. And so I would highly recommend waiting. You don't even necessarily have to wait until Friday. Like if you have time in between Wednesday and Friday, by all means, go ahead and get started. But the reason we're not having class Fridays is so that time is blocked out for you to complete that activity, which is serving or replacing the in-class discussions, where in class you would be able to engage and discuss, engage with the material and discuss those concepts and terms and apply them to your own life and everyday life in general. Because the point isn't so that you can just simply answer the questions and complete the activity and get a grade. The point is that it's a learning tool. And if you're not using it as a learning tool, then you're using that inappropriately and you're probably not going to do as well. And I'm typically, especially within this area, I'm typically pretty laid back on grading. I'll ask you a lot of different questions that hopefully prompt your thinking in different directions. I'm not necessarily looking for a right or correct answer. I'm looking to see that you engaged with the material and that you are answering, your responses are being guided from an identity and social identity perspective. And especially with this activity, since you've already completed one that had to do with symbolic interaction, with this activity, even if you give a paragraph response, if it's not from an identity or social identity perspective, if you didn't in some way integrate some of those terms or concepts into your response, you're not going to get any credit for that answer. And I understand that might be a little concerning, but I promise that after grading thousands and thousands of papers over the years, it's very clear when someone has engaged with the material, at least to some extent. Even if they're not applying everything, perfectly, it's very clear when someone is actively trying to integrate what they've learned in that section. And so again, please make sure that you are consuming the material, you're engaging with the material, and you're responding to the questions and the activities from those perspectives. But moving on, so now we're covering social identity theory and a bit of background. So social identity theory, it's a theory that analyzes the role of self-conception in group membership, group processes, and intergroup relations. It's a theory that predicts certain intergroup behaviors on the basis of perceived group status differences and perceived legitimacy and stability. And it suggests that an organization or group can change individual behaviors if it can modify that individual's self-identity or self-concept, and that's related to a person's attachment to the group. It also addresses prejudice, discrimination, ethnocentrism, stereotyping, intergroup conflict, conformity, normative behavior, group polarization, crowd behavior, organizational behavior, leadership, deviance, and group cohesiveness. And it emerged, there was a researcher who's very much interested in this topic following World War II, and he didn't believe that these large-scale social phenomena could be satisfactorily explained in terms of personality or interpersonal interactions. Instead, he believed that social forces configured individual actions, that it was social forces that were responsible to a large extent of how people were behaving in groups. And this means that the theory does not attempt to explain these phenomena, that is group behavior, as the expression of personality traits or these individual differences. Instead, it's looking at how the group itself influences not only individual behavior, but how that behavior is motivated and driven by a person's identity, their self-concept. So what we talked about Monday. So in the Robbers Cave experiment, it talked about a lot of different points in social psychology. One is conflict. But in terms of social identity theory, it arose from the same, interest in these perceptual processes that resulted in stereotypes and prejudice. So the Robbers Cave experiment was actually conducted in Oklahoma at Robbers Cave State Park. They picked 22 white 11-year-old boys. They all had very similar backgrounds, all came from Protestant families, from the same class background. Their parents were very similar in terms of occupation and education. So when they were assigned to different groups, there was no difference between these boys. I mean, in a lot of ways. They were very much, came from very similar backgrounds, very similar descriptions. And so when they were assigned to groups, it was, group membership was essentially meaningless. But nevertheless, they ended up favoring the group that they were assigned to despite receiving no personal benefit. And so when they entered into these groups, they gave them the names, the Eagles and the Rattlers, and they designed this 4-day kind of group bonding where they participated in things like swimming and hiking and building shelter and fishing and all sorts of things. And it allowed them to bond as a group, but they were also in competition with the other group. And so they might play like tug of war or have races or whatever the case may be. But there were these 4 days of different competitive events. And after that, they found that the boys were characterizing the other team very differently than they were characterizing their own team. And they noticed this specifically after these different physical and verbal forms of prejudice between the groups began to emerge. And they each favored their in-group over their out-group, even though there was virtually no difference between the two groups. And when the researchers tried to decrease this prejudice, tried to work it out, and they increased contact, and by simply increasing contact where they were around each other more, they found actually increased conflict. But what actually ended up reducing the conflict and creating more of a cohesive group between the two groups was having them work together towards a common goal. And so if you're viewing this online, I recommend clicking on the link. I don't know if I'm sure you can't do it through the video, but you can do it through the PDF slides, and it's a quick, 4 or 5 minute video on the Robbers Cave experiment. And so the study demonstrated that group membership was so powerful that simply classifying people into groups is enough to make people think of themselves in terms of that group membership. And this characterization led to in-group favoritism and out-group discrimination, indicating that intergroup conflict could exist in the absence of any direct competition between groups. And so on the basis of this research, social identity was described as the concept of social identity. It was created as a means to consider the way one conceptualizes the self on the basis of the social groups to which a person belongs. And so, again, participants favored their own in-group, even if they received no personal benefit. They found that all the boys were, simply because they'd been classified into these groups, even though they were arbitrary, they thought they constructed their own self-concept based off of their group membership. And that they displayed, and that this social categorization of the Rattlers versus the Eagles, it led to this in-group favoritism and out-group discrimination. And even once they stopped having direct competitions, that conflict remained. And so, taken from the Robbers Cave experiment and some of those more key concepts and the origins of social identity theory, two things that really interested researchers were the cognitive processes associated with or that led people to define their group memberships and the group itself, as well as the motivational processes that enable people to maintain a positive social identity. And that's referring to those more favorable comparisons to other groups, so that in-group favoritism. And so now as we move on to a brief overview of social identity theory, I want you to keep these things in mind, what we discussed Monday, as well as the origins of social identity theory itself and how it might differ from identity theory, given that the origins are a bit different and they're asking different questions. So, from a social identity perspective, there are three aspects of the self. There is the individual self, which is defined by personal traits, differentiating the self from all others. There's the relational self, which is defined by a dyadic relationships between the self and a specific other person. And so one thing you might see a few more times in this class is dyadic, or a dyad and a triad. And so when we're looking at interactions, a dyad is simply an interaction, most basic terms is it's an interaction between two people. And a triad is an interaction between three people, which we'll get to here in a minute in terms of what defines a group. But a relational self is defined by those one-on-one relationships you have between yourself and, specific other people. And then you have a collective self, and that is defined by group membership and what differentiates us from them. And so again, from a social identity perspective, when we talk about the self, we're not just talking about one thing. We're talking about the individual self, the relational self, and the collective self. So the individual self is like you and who you are, those personal traits that make you different from others. But a relational self is who you are in relation to other people. And then your collective self, it's those, the self in terms of those broader groups. Who is us and who is them? And you belong to a variety of groups. So there's not just one us and one them. There's so many different groups. And all of these things make up the self from a social identity perspective. And then we have the types of social identity. So again, we were just talking about the self and the three different aspects of the self. And now we're talking about those different types of social identity. So from this particular theory, when we're discussing social identity, we're either talking about person-based, relational, group-based, or collective. And so person-based social identities emphasize how properties of groups are internalized by individual group members as part of the self-concept. And so that is, again, that it's emphasizing how these properties of different groups, like what does it mean to be a part of this group? What are the characteristics of this group? It's looking at how a person internalizes that and how they see themselves as a member in this group, and whether that's in relation to other members or those outside, but how do they see themselves in terms of their membership in this group? And then we have relational, and so relational social identities define the self in relation to specific other people with whom one interacts in a group context. And so whereas a person-based one is like, how does this person conceive of themselves in terms of the characteristics of this group? A relational social identity is how the self, it defines the self in relation to specific other people in that group. And so just like a relational self, it's, the self in relation to another person, a relational social identity is yourself in relation to another person in that group. And then group-based social identities are equivalent to social identity as is traditionally defined. And so that would be like those broad social categorizations, like maybe class, all those aspects of social structure, like race, class, gender, religion, and so on. So those group-based social identities, that's what that's referring to. And then you have the collective identities. It refers to a process whereby group members do not just share self-defining attributes, but also engage in social interaction to forge an image of what the group stands for and how it is represented and viewed by others. And so, from a social identity perspective, a social group must have at least 3 people. So there must be at least a triad for something to become a group. 2 people is not considered a group. A dyad isn't a group, but it has to have at least 3 or more people to be considered a group. And social identity theory links individual cognition, social interaction, and societal processes, specifically in terms of different social groups. And so, social identity theory, it defines, when we're talking about a group, it's defined a little bit differently. So it's not just 3 or more people, but it's defined cognitively in terms of people's self-conception as group members. So a group is not just like physically, like there's 3 people present and you all are part of a group. It's you're seeing yourself as part of a group. And a group exists psychologically if 3 or more people kind of construct, and evaluate themselves in terms of these shared attributes or perceived shared attributes that distinguish them collectively from other people. So it's not just 3 people makes a group, but 3 people who see themselves as a group and evaluate themselves in relation to that group and that group's characteristics. And going back to what we originally discussed, is that all of this is tied to attachment to a group and the nature of that attachment. And so here we're going to discuss the types of attachments to groups. First and foremost, groups are not the same. One broad distinction is between similarity-based categorical groups and interaction-based dynamic groups. And so you have these similarity-based groups or common identity groups based on direct attachment to the group. And that some of the antecedents to that group's formation and operation are social categorization. So that is simply creating those groups, applying these categories or creating these categories. Interdependence and the presence of an outgroup. And then you have interaction-based groups or common bond groups. They're based upon attachment among members. And so some of the antecedents there are social interaction is critical. There's sharing of this personal information, and there's this interpersonal similarities. And so in a common identity group, people are attracted to the group's norms, goals, activities, and other defining features, whereas a common bond group comprise members who are attracted to one another as individuals. And so some of the convergent consequences, and what this means is that regardless of the type of attachment to a group, in some ways they have very similar consequences. And so some of these are that both forms of attachment lead members to perceive a group as cohesive, to identify with the group, and to evaluate their groups more favorably than other groups as compared to situations in which neither type of attachment is present. And both actually increase positive feelings toward a group, increase participation, and increase the likelihood of remaining in the group. And although they do have similar consequences in some ways, these different types of attachments and why people are attached to these groups, because these can be applied to any group, and how there are these different types of attachment. And although they can result in similar things, they also diverge in many ways in terms of their consequences. Because the way people are attached to groups can affect a variety of outcomes. So each has different effects on, and so I took these specifically from some research on online communities and groups that have formed online. So keep that in mind for some of these points. But each type of attachment has different effects on what people talk about. Social loafing, the experience of newcomers, the amount and type of reciprocity, and the robustness or salience of community membership. So, for common bond groups, they're more likely to engage in off-topic discussion and will be more tolerant of off-topic discussion than people who feel identity-based attachment. They're also less likely to compensate for others' under-contribution. So that means they're less likely to sanction people who aren't contributing as much to the group than those who feel identity-based attachment. They're also more likely to engage in direct reciprocity, and by that it means they're more likely to directly help individual members of that group, or directly help people who have helped them. Or let's say someone does something nice for you. You're going to directly, you're going to try to find ways where you can, repay them in some way by doing something nice for them. However, for common bond groups, it's a bit more difficult for newcomers to join the group than it is for identity-based groups. The attachment should wane or decrease with membership turnover. And so that would make sense in terms of if this is a common bond group, people are attracted to the group because they, on a very individual basis, they like the people who are in the group. And as, people, come in and others leave, the original reason why you're there, the relationships that you built, if they're no longer within that group, then that's going to decrease your attachment to that group and that community. But for common identity groups, they're more likely to conform with group norms than those who feel bond-based attachment. They're more likely to engage in generalized reciprocity. And so what that means is helping any member. And so again, common identity groups, they're less personal in terms of, common bonds are coming together because you have more similarities. You are specifically participating in this group and you're a member of this group because you like the other group members. And so common identity groups are typically less personal. And so people are more likely to help any one person in the group, but not necessarily directly help those who've helped them. They might, you might call it pay it forward. And newcomers tend to feel more welcomed in these identity-based groups, again, because there aren't these existing strong relational bonds and friendships and cliques within a group. So it's a little bit easier for newcomers to be welcomed into a group that is identity-based in terms of their attachment. And they also tend to perceive each other as an interchangeable part of the group, again, because it's less personal. So as people leave or membership increases or both, that's not necessarily as big of a deal because you don't have as close of a relationship with the people in that group. And so people tend to be more interchangeable because it's not really about those more personal relationships, because it's based on this common identity instead of a common bond. And then finally, attachment to the group, in this case, should decrease with discussion diversity or a drift away from the core topic. Meaning that as there is again, this was specifically from online communities, as there is this diversity of discussion and off-topic discussion, that means that it's shifting away from that common identity. That people are bringing in, other identities that they hold. They're having different discussions. And so the reason why they were there in the first place, that common identity, that common thread, is no longer present or it's waning. So their attachment to that group will begin to decrease with that over time. And so, in terms of social categorization, people cognitively represent a category or group as a prototype. And so, you can think of prototype or stereotype, could be a good word here. Social categorization, it is the cognitive basis of social identity processes. When we talk of groups, we're talking about categories of people or social categories. From this perspective, from a social identity perspective, people cognitively represent these categories as prototypes or a fuzzy set of attributes, meaning like these perceptions, attitudes, feelings, and behaviors that are related to one another in a meaningful way, and that simultaneously captures similarities within the group and differences between the group and other groups or people who are not in the group. And prototypes describe these categories and also evaluate them and prescribe membership-related behavior, meaning it's not only giving like a description of these characteristics of what it means to be in this category, to be in this group, but it gives you almost criteria to evaluate yourself in terms of that criteria. And keep in mind that being a part of this group, and there's certain prototype or criteria of what it means to be a part of this group, some people meet that criteria more than others. So we embody these criteria, like how someone is just like the epitome of we'll say the epitome of a graduate student. They just totally embody what that means in every sense of the word. And those who don't necessarily meet up to that criteria, or they don't fit that criteria as well, within groups, they typically don't have as much influence as those who absolutely like embody what it means to be a part of that group. And because of that, those who fit that criteria best or exemplify that criteria best, because they tend to have more influence, or at least they're more well-liked, typically, they also tend to have more influence within the group. But also these categories, these prototypes also prescribe membership-related behavior. So it's telling you how you should behave, how you should think, how you should feel within this group, as well as in relation to other members, and certainly in relation to people outside of that group. And social categorization depersonalizes both in-group and out-group members. Depersonalized perception of out-group members is more commonly called stereotyping. You view them as being similar to one another and having out-group attributes. When you categorize yourself, that same depersonalization process applies. You view yourself in terms of the attributes of the out-group, so you're self-stereotyping. And since prototypes also describe and prescribe group-appropriate ways to feel and behave, you will then, as a result, feel and behave normatively. And make sure to note that word. It's not normally, but normatively. So in alignment with those normative expectations. So like norms. And then, in this way, self-categorization produces within a group conformity and patterns of in-group liking, trust, and solidarity. Depersonalization means viewing yourself as a category representative rather than a unique individual, and this is also associated with a change in identity typically, or it very much shapes your identity. But de-individuation refers to a loss of identity, often under conditions of anonymity, which is associated with primitive, antisocial, and aggressive impulses. And to learn more about this, I highly recommend, and I'm sure some of you have heard of Zimbardo, and the work that was done in the 1970s very much discusses this de-individuation process. And it can produce antisocial and aggressive behavior when people identify with a group that has a prototype prescribing such conduct. And so those are some of the results and characteristics of social categorization. But the motivation for doing so, this social identity, it's motivated by two processes, one being self-enhancement and the other is uncertainty reduction. And these motivations cause groups to strive to be both better than, and distinct from other groups. If we're looking at the motivation of self-enhancement, it refers to a belief that we are better than them. And this is motivated by self-esteem. And self-esteem motivates group identification. So it motivates you to identify with a group. And also motivates intergroup behavior as identification elevates self-esteem. And another motivation being uncertainty reduction. And this reduces uncertainty because it furnishes group prototypes that describe how people, including the self, will and ought to behave and interact with one another. Since prototypes are relatively consensual, thus one's worldview and self-concept are validated. Social categorization renders one's own and others' behavior predictable, and thus allows you to avoid harm, and it allows you to plan effective action. It also allows you to know how one should feel and how one should behave. So it reduces that uncertainty. It gives kind of a prescription for how to see the world, how to behave, how to feel, how to react, and how to respond to others. So in summary, whereas social comparisons in interpersonal and intragroup contexts are oriented toward similarity, assimilation, and uniformity, intergroup comparisons, so between groups, have a different logic. Social comparisons between groups are focused on the establishment of distinctiveness, so difference. And furthermore, because social identity not only describes but also evaluates who one is, intergroup comparisons strive towards in-group distinctiveness that can be evaluated in a positive way. And this explains why groups tend to compete to be both different and better, why they struggle over things like status, prestige, and distinctiveness. But other than that, I hope you all have a wonderful week and an excellent weekend. Make sure to complete Activity 3, begin your reading for next week, and watch the supplementary videos. Thanks.